everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This conversation is going to be a delight for those who enjoy reading and for anyone who would like to understand how to use books, physical or audio, for holistic well being. So, before we begin, I just want to let you know that this conversation is organized by HealthOmind, which is a mental wellness startup based in Bangalore. Its efforts are directed towards creating awareness about mental health and well being in people across the nation. HealthOmind aspires to build an ecosystem that will enable people to tackle their mental health problems while fighting the stigma around it. HealthOmind looks at mental wellness from a holistic perspective, and that's what differentiates them from other organizations. So, thank you so much for joining us on a Sunday afternoon. If you can hear us clearly and if we're visible, please may I request you to type one in the chat box. Super. So people are still joining in, but I would like to introduce the person I'm going to talk to today. My name is Apekshita, and today I'm going to talk to Bijal Shah. Bijal Shah is a bibliotherapist, counselor, author, and poet. She is the founder of Book Therapy, which offers individual, couples, and group bibliotherapy, literary curation, and personalized reading services, as well as bibliotherapy training. Bijal's book recommendations have featured in The Guardian, Marie Claire, NBC News, Asian Voice, and various other publications. She is a member of the International Federation of Library Associations and the American Library Association. She is also the author of the non-fiction book The Happiness Mindset, which has received more than 50 reviews on Amazon with a 5-star rating. Prior to bibliotherapy, Bijal was an investment banker after completing a postgraduate professional accountancy qualification. She has a bachelor's of science in mathematics from the University of Warwick after attending Haberdasher's Ask School for Girls. She is a mother of two and currently resides in Hampstead, London with her husband. Hi, Bijal. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Apekshita. How are you? Thank you so much
Great.
for having me.
Superb. I'm very excited to begin this conversation. I was just wondering if you could begin by telling us what really got you interested in books. So you're an author, you're a poet, and now you're helping people feel better through books. So what really got you interested in the first place?
Sure. So, I think this has always been in the making as a child. I grew up in East Africa, in Kenya, and given the security issues and everything in Kenya, which is I don't know if you guys know much about Kenya, but it's not the safest place in the world. And I just grew up around libraries and books, and my parents would buy me a book every single week. We'd be going to bookstores, and I think it sort of cemented my belief in books from a very young age. And I would always be turning to books during life transitions, as we all do, just as a form of escapism, as a form of therapy. But when I really started getting serious about books was when I was working in investment banking. I actually did a part-time diploma in counseling and psychotherapy. And what I noticed during my counseling and therapy sessions was that I would leverage literature to really help me understand concepts better, understand what my therapist was telling me. I began to notice that a lot of psychological foundations were based in sort of Greek mythology and Seneca and Stoicism. So there was a lot of literature that was involved in pioneering the modern basis of psychology and psychotherapy. And I thought there's something really powerful here. Literature is, like any art form, can provide a lot of healing, understanding. It sort of enables us to reflect on ourselves. We can resonate with the feelings, with the characters, what people are going through. So I thought, I want to explore this a little bit further. So in 2014, I started connecting with a lot of bibliotherapists internationally. So one of the people that who's really inspired me is a Finnish bibliotherapist, Pirjo Siviletto. I've got a blog post on my website with her, but she has been a fundamental pioneer in Finland on bibliotherapy. And, we did a lot of research together, and I eventually developed this 3-step methodology on how literature can be, therapeutic, and how to address sort of issues using literature, which I'll talk about. But that was really the basis. And that was all sort of coming together in sort of between 2014 and 2017. I also published a book called The Happiness Mindset, which was integrating lots of different Eastern and Western concepts on, living a more content life, living a more sort of value-based life. And I wrote that in 2014, and I sort of started putting together all this sort of literature, psychology, and therapy into a more comprehensive methodology. And then in 2017, when my husband had an international assignment in San Francisco, I kind of left my job and decided to launch Bibliotherapy full-time, offering bibliotherapy sessions, but also curating something called personalized book prescriptions, which are actually reading lists based on a client's issues, needs, whatever their goals are, whatever their mental health issue is, which is essentially a reading list with unlimited sort of email support for 2 weeks. And then if they want to add the bibliotherapy sessions to it as a form of bibliocounseling, they can. So that was essentially sort of my journey into bibliotherapy.
Right, absolutely. So before we get into what, how you work with clients when it comes to bibliotherapy, could you give our participants a brief understanding of what bibliotherapy is and how has it evolved? You mentioned a bit in your journey, but if you could just give us a brief idea of what this is about. Yeah.
Sure. So bibliotherapy is actually a form of art therapy. So literature is a form of art, and it's an artistic therapy. So, you have things like dance therapy or storytelling therapy or cinema therapy. These are all forms of art. You even have art therapy and play therapy for children. So the fundamental thing to remember is it's a form of art therapy. And a lot of art therapy can be very sort of it's self-therapy. So you don't always need an external therapist to help you heal, but you can always use one as a facilitator. So in my case, it would be a bibliotherapist or even some librarians and mental health workers. But my definition, or book therapy's definition of bibliotherapy, is essentially a form of art therapy that uses the power of stories to heal. And it is that relationship between the reader and the writing that enables and facilitates that therapy. And upon examination and self-reflection through the words, the writing, you actually get to a stage where you identify coping mechanisms, you release emotions, you relieve a lot of feelings, you experience catharsis, and then towards the end of that, you are essentially identifying some goals and coping strategies to move forward. So essentially, that's our definition of bibliotherapy, a book therapy. And the way it has evolved is, it's been around for millennia. We had the ancient Greeks, Aristotle, we had the ancient Egyptians, King Ramses II. They were all using books as a form of healing. They used to call it healing for the soul. But where it really took off was in the early 19th century, in the early 20th century, where a lot of psychiatric institutions would have libraries associated with them. Because back then, mental health wasn't a thing. I think lots of people relied on religion to sort of cover that, to meet that gap. And then, literature sort of started coming forward, and a lot of military hospitals in World War II had, literature as a way of placating the soldiers, as a way of providing comfort. And a lot of that was done in the form of poetry. So poetry was huge. You had a lot of doctors who were also poets, for example, John Keats. So they did a lot of, poetry prescription and sort of enabling that relationship between the patient and the doctor to really come alive through poetry and expressing emotions, feelings, experiencing catharsis, all of that. So that really took off then in the early sort of 20th century. And then one of the big pioneers of bibliotherapy is somebody called Caroline Schroeds, and her dissertation back in the 1950s really identified this sort of three-step methodology for bibliotherapy. One was sort of the identification with the character or the text, establishing that connections, striking a chord with the reader that actually I can really relate to this. This is something that I've experienced. And then sort of, getting the reader to focus, do a bit of self-examination, reflection on what's coming through for them through the writing, either through the form of journaling or some sort of unstructured writing. And then thirdly is that sort of resonance and experience of catharsis, which was, which then is liberating because you feel free of your emotions, you feel understood, you feel validated. And then obviously at bibliotherapy, we add the fourth step, which is we've got to work out what your coping strategies and your goals are going to be going forward based on the reflection you've done, based on, how, that healing that you've been processing through the literature. So that essentially has been, I think, the story of bibliotherapy. And, I just like to add that Stoicism, for me, it permeates a lot of bibliotherapy, as well as George Eliot's work. So George Eliot was a wonderful writer, and she's the author of Mill on the Floss, The Last Mana. Her writing is pretty much as though a proto-psychologist is the narrator, and she touches on a lot of complex human emotions and she examines those emotions, holding that complexity within her writing. And a lot of her ideas really pioneered the foundations of psychology, and a lot of Freudian stuff has been based on the work that she's done. So it's really fascinating. And there's a lady called Dr. Kelda Green who at the University of Liverpool here in the UK has written a book called Rethinking Therapeutic Literature. And a lot of her research is based on the effects of, Stoicism, Wordsworth, George Eliot, all of these great authors that have really set the stage for bibliotherapy.
Mm-hmm. And who among these have proved to be the biggest inspirations for you? Who do you go back to when you're, trying to find the best books to prescribe to your clients?
I think Greek mythology is fantastic. Things of the story of Narcissus, a lot of the archetypes that we see in ourselves is captured within Greek mythology, and a lot of Jungian work which talks about archetypes. Again, the foundations have been Greek mythology. So I think Greek mythology is huge, and I think a lot of Hindu literature. Again, there's a lot of mythology in there that represents our inner selves. Although I don't know that much about Hindu literature, and that's probably something that I would like to touch on. But I'm just sort of drawing a comparison between how Greek mythology has probably informed some Hindu mythology as well, and then obviously informed a lot of therapeutic reading. And then obviously I love George Eliot's work. I don't know if you've read her books, but I think they really have a power to captivate the audience and facilitate that bibliotherapy.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. But maybe George Eliot's work will not be appropriate for everybody. So how do you typically try to understand what kind of books to recommend, and what does a typical session look like?
Sure. So, the most important thing, as you said, is it has to be a right fit for the reader. Otherwise, they're just not going to complete reading the literature. They're not going to connect. The connection to the text, to the literature, is supremely important. And before I start any sort of bibliotherapy session, I have a questionnaire that I get my clients to fill out, which talks about what their current situation is, what they're looking to achieve through therapy, how they're currently feeling, and then also working out what sort of genres they like. So some people are massive fiction readers, others are nonfiction. So that's really important, because if you want somebody to finish a book, you've got to be prescribing something that's their preferred medium or genre. As well as working out, are they paperback readers, are they Kindle readers, are they audio? So, some people love to listen, some people are very visual, so they prefer like Kindle or paperback. Some people are very kinetic, so they prefer paperback. So, all of these questions are things that I would ask at the start of the session. And then I would take away what they've told me and we'd have a mutual maybe conversation over email, and I'd start creating their curated reading list. And then if they've also opted for the bibliotherapy session, then we will definitely do a bit of counselling alongside the text. And unstructured writing is a really, really big part of bibliotherapy. So journaling and either writing letters to yourself or somebody else, or some sort of poetry, to really reflect on how you've felt the text to be, therapeutic, what has hit a chord with you, how are you feeling, what emotions have been, what emotional buttons have been pushed by this text. So we need to get all that information out, and then sort of discuss and process through, what you're feeling, process through emotions, and then head towards a more cathartic, we want to get to that place of catharsis.
Absolutely. Could you describe your relationship with a particular client and how did that journey sort of take place? Maybe tell us what they were facing and what kind of books did you recommend, and how did the support eventually help them cope with what they were facing?
Yeah, sure. So I'll give you a couple of case studies. I'll probably give you lots more case studies in my workshop, but I'll give you a couple of case studies now. So you've got group bibliotherapy, which was essentially a form of group therapy. And we had one for grieving mothers who've had miscarriages, and they're all sort of feeling this sense of loss, and there's a real anger, because, as particularly within any sort of Asian society or wider, loss or death isn't talked about much, and sometimes people just shy away, so they're not able to support those who've experienced loss, or, either lost a child. So what we did was, through group bibliotherapy, we read a poem called John Donohue's poem. It was called For Grief. And what was really powerful in terms of group bibliotherapy is, not only are you're connecting with the other group members who've all experienced loss. So you feel very sort of validated, your experience feels very shared. You feel less alone in your plight. And then secondly, you're connecting with the words of the poet. And as you're reading the poem, you start to feel, gosh, somebody really understands what I'm going through. I feel totally heard. I feel seen. I feel visible, because now somebody is understanding what I've gone through. And then obviously in that group bibliotherapy session, it sort of opens up the dialogue. People are able to express how they feel, express their feelings, cry, any sort of emotional release is wonderful. It's really providing that relief. They're also experiencing a sense of empathy for others, but also feeling understood themselves. Others are empathizing with them. So, it's that sort of group bibliotherapy, that communal power, is really, really powerful. So that's been wonderful. And then I've also done I also do children's bibliotherapy. So, I've had little children, like toddlers, who are facing separation anxiety when they're starting school, and are struggling and not happy about going to school, are unable to sleep at night. So I do use sort of picture books with them, and a bit of play therapy, to allow them to sort of, they don't have the language to express how they're feeling, so we kind of have to work out what it is. They might be like, well, I'm missing my mummy, or I don't feel like I want to eat my lunch at school, or I don't feel comfortable. So I prescribe books like Wembley Worried by Kevin Hank, and Wilma the Worry Machine, which provides coping strategies for kids. So your friends might be going through something similar. Maybe you can give them a hug. Maybe you can go and talk to your teacher if you're feeling a bit anxious. And it's a lot of this is done through play therapy and toys, because of, again, with little toddlers, it's very hard to provide talk therapy. But picture books are great, because there's that connection with the text, connection with the characters. And I also use something called, actually, these reading affirmation cards for kids. I don't know if you can see it, but which are great, because they allow children to really turn to books when they're feeling a bit low. I think books about representation, i.e. they feel like their story is represented in that book, whether it's a book about loss, a book about first day at school. is very healing for them. And so I encourage that sort of, turning to books, and my affirmations, there's sort of 18 affirmation cards that are in there that we use to establish this love of reading and love of literature from very early on.
Right. There is this assumption that only book lovers might enjoy bibliotherapy, or it's something that will impact them. But what you're telling us is essentially that anybody can benefit from bibliotherapy, anybody who's going through something that they would like to be addressed. So, is there more resistance when you're dealing with people who don't have a history of reading? How is that experience like, and how do you then try to bring them to this part of the island where we all love reading?
Yes, absolutely. So, you get, of course, the readers love reading their paper books and the Kindle, but if you're not a big reader, you have the option of audiobooks because you can listen in to stories. And that's almost as effective as reading, because you're feeling a connection. Reading is an act of empathy, so you're empathizing with the characters. So you are connecting. And so if you're not a big fan of reading, or you feel anxious about reading, or you're shying away from it, or you have some sort of dyslexia or other mental issue that's preventing you from reading, audiobooks are a wonderful, wonderful way to connect and to get into it. And that would be something that I would take into account and then prescribe. I'd also say a lot of children's books are wonderful for adults as well, and these are picture books or graphic novels, which is the adult picture books like comic books, etc., which are wonderful for somebody who's not a serious reader but kind of wants to just get into a story and wants to connect. And so those are the sorts of tools I would use for somebody who is not a super reader but who I think would benefit from this sort of storytelling therapy and connection with the text. That's kind of the way I would go.
Oh, absolutely. So, I mean, one part is where people read themselves, and the other, which you've also been talking about, is when you talk about what they've read. So, whether how they identify with characters and how they feel when they read about a particular plot or a setting or a conflict that a book might throw at them. So, how do you encourage them to not let what they've read sort of vaporize? How do you encourage them to keep that in mind, to learn from it, and to then incorporate that in their own lives?
Sure. So a big part of this therapy is journaling, and it's book journaling and unstructured writing in the form of letters or poetry. So I think writing is actually, even though you're reading, writing is a really, really big part of therapy, because you're capturing how you're feeling, you're keeping a diary, you're coming back to it maybe in a day or a week to see if you still feel the same. If you don't feel the same, that's fine. If you still feel the same, what are you going to do about it? You're also recognizing thought patterns, you're also recognizing feelings. It's highly therapeutic. Just writing something down is therapeutic in itself. And honestly, I sometimes feel like the best poetry is written when you're in the midst of this crazy emotions of anger or upset, because you're really capturing how you're feeling. And that's going to really resonate with yourself or with other people who read your poetry, because you have really captured the emotion. So I would say that writing is a big part of bibliotherapy practice. If you're not a big writer, the other thing I'd say is voice journaling. So in WhatsApp you can record voice notes, or on any other medium where you can record voice notes. Just recording those voice notes and then listening back to them, your own voice, is actually really healing, because you feel like, oh my God, I understand how I'm feeling. Somebody's listening to me, even if it's just you playing your own voice back. I think it's very therapeutic. So I would suggest that. There's also art therapy, drawing, to sort of capture an emotion, just capture how you're feeling. It's in essence, it's capturing those emotions, which will then give way to sort of a bit more self-reflection. Yeah.
Sure. And people who've tried this, what do they come and tell you? What is their feedback like when maybe a couple of weeks pass and they listen to their own voice or they read their journals again? What is that interaction like?
Yeah, people feel very sort of, the first thing they'll say is, I felt very connected. I felt connected to myself. I felt connected to others. I felt very relieved. I felt a bit liberated. I felt a sense of freedom. I felt lighter because I've gotten rid of these horrible emotions that were holding me hostage. I have a sense of a better understanding of myself, or I've discovered these coping strategies that this character used, for example, in my sort of children's bibliotherapy, they've found breathing exercises, or just talking to somebody, or kind of going away and just taking a walk, or just they've found ways of coping through the literature. So so I've had, it's been really helpful for people, and some of these things take time. They might not happen overnight, but you kind of have to see it through. But the great thing about bibliotherapy is it's something that you can do yourself, self-bibliotherapy. So it's an ongoing process, and at the end of the day, we are all works in progress. Like, I know people who've been in therapy for years and they'll never stop, because that's their coping strategy. So the nice thing about, if you're a book lover, or if you've got any interest in the therapeutic part of literature, this is something that you can use as on a lifelong basis. And then obviously, if you want a facilitator, such as a bibliotherapist or a librarian, or somebody to come in and to help with the session counselor, you can always do that.
Sure. You've mentioned it. You've mentioned that people can be their own bibliotherapist, but how can they go about it? How would you recommend that they make their own reading lists, or how do they then read a particular chapter and then sort of journal what they're feeling, or send themselves voice notes? How would you suggest they go about it?
Yeah, sure. So I think that, the big thing is working out, does this story or does this character fit within my interest, within my, with what I'm going through? Am I going to feel connected to this protagonist? Or, and that's obviously a lot from the blurb, but blurb and reviews and ratings. But you can also then go away and see, is this fiction? Is this non-fiction? It's just something that I'm going to connect with. So, that's part of and this is something that I'll go through in the workshop in more detail, in terms of identifying a methodology for self-selecting books. But it's a lot about, can I connect with the protagonist? Can I connect with the character? Can I connect with this text? Is this a medium for me? Is the genre right for me? Can I listen to this? Or can I mean, often people will not read something because they want to listen to it. And if they can't find that book, they won't read it. So all of these things come into account, because it's all about committing to the literature and finishing it. So you've got to find something that's going to work for you. And then as part of that practice, it's the journaling, the unstructured writing, the book journal. You've got to be doing that as well at the same time. And I think, there's 4 traits that you really need. I think you really need to really get the most out of it, which is being open to the literature, being able to analyze the literature, being able to reflect on the literature, and also, with any therapy, having some hope that there is change is possible. And at the end of the day, you want to be empowered, and you want to be you want to be able to move forward from the place that you're at. So all of these things are important. Empathy is very important. Reading is an act of empathy at the end of the day. So I often find, if you're not, empathy is a big part of the therapy being effective.
Right. So, I mean, I try to read a lot, and anytime I recommend a book to a friend, they'll just wave it off, saying that probably I'll just wait for the movie to come out. So is that something that you also experience? Do people say that I'll just watch the adaptation and maybe that'll do the same thing that a book is supposed to?
Yeah, I mean, there is cinema therapy, so, which of course, again, is a form of art therapy. So it's very much based on the power of the story to heal, and that connection that we feel with the characters on screen. So that certainly is something that's therapeutic. I think you would still have to do the journaling alongside, the unstructured writing alongside, as a form of self-reflection and examination. You'd still have to do that. I feel that literature is a bit more effective than cinema therapy, just because it's very much tailored to how you want to view this, how you want to connect, how you want, it's not somebody else's adaptation, it's your adaptation, which I think that makes it that much more stronger.
Sure, absolutely. So, our participants were going to open this panel for questions. So please type in your questions, and we'll take them as you send us questions. We already have one question from Jyoti Bijal. She's asking, "Do you think bibliotherapy can be helpful for children with autism or ADHD? What do you
Yes,
think?"
absolutely. I think, people with autism, ADHD, they really struggle to express their emotions. So, they don't really have that language. And so when you've got picture books that represent how they're feeling, that can be a really good medium through which to get them to connect with themselves and also express how they're feeling. So bibliotherapy children's bibliotherapy is excellent for people with autism or ADHD. You could combine that with a bit of play therapy and also with a bit of drawing
Mhm.
and art therapy to get that process kick-started. Yeah.
Sure, absolutely. I have one question before while we wait for our participants to send in. A lot of times people might just not relate to a particular book that you've suggested or they've picked for themselves. And
Yeah,
is it a big no-no to stop it and to go to something else? How do you deal with that?
absolutely.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about connection. If you're not connecting with the book, there's no point wasting your time. Honestly, you shouldn't ever feel like forced or pressured to finish something that is just not working for you, because there's so many books out there. There will be literature that you connect with. So we would then, rework something that is a better fit for you, or you can, if you're doing self bibliotherapy, you can go and do a bit more research on something that you feel will be a better fit. I mean, because there's times when you just don't connect with the author's writing and you just feel like I'm just not connecting here. So, really listen to your intuition. Are you connecting with the text, with the author? That's really important.
Absolutely. One common question that I'm sure you get a lot is that how is bibliotherapy or talking to a counselor different from, say, a book club where everybody sits together and talks about books? Could you
Uh,
tell us? Yeah.
yeah, I get that all the time, actually. So book club is very much just, it's almost like talking about the characters, just talk about the stories, a bit of gossiping, which is not a bad thing. But and it's great, but I think how group bibliotherapy is different is that you are connecting with the group members, you're connecting with a purpose, with a shared purpose of achieving a therapeutic outcome. And you're connecting with the text because you want to you want it to lead to a sort of emotional release of what you are feeling. You want that relief. And then you're trying to process your feelings, and then you're trying to work out what your next steps are going to be. Um, so it's very much it's very much a shared empathy practice. Whereas book club is very much, I just want to talk about the books and the characters because I loved it so much. But there's no sort of emphasis on empathy or connection or relief of emotional feelings.
Mhm, mhm. Right. We have a related question. Somebody's asking, how long does the healing process typically take through this therapy? Of course, it's not an easy answer, but if you could give us some sense of a timeline in our
Yeah,
busy world.
sure.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to give you like the classic answer that all therapists give, which is it'll take as long as it takes. It can, for some people, it can be an overnight form of healing. Like you just something just resonates with you, and there's an instant shift. For others, it's very much, for things like trauma, something that is not going to happen overnight. That's something that's going to take a while to work through. And that could be anything from like 6 months to a year to 2 years. And for some people, if it's, like post-traumatic stress disorder, it could be a lifetime. But it's something that you need to be, it's part of your self-care practice. You need to be doing something for your mental well-being, like just how you go to the gym every day or regularly. You need to be doing something that's self-care every day, that's looking after your mental well-being. And bibliotherapy is something that is definitely meets that criteria, I guess, of being a regular aspect of self-care.
Absolutely. So Avantika Kapadia wants to know, Bijal, what qualities do you look for in clients when you recommend bibliotherapy, and which therapies can bibliotherapy supplement? Example, humanistic, psychodynamic, etc.
Sure. So bibliotherapy is I'll answer the second question first, which is bibliotherapy can supplement any sort of therapeutic practice, whether that's play therapy with children, art therapy, whether that's psychodynamic, psychotherapy, humanistic, gestalt. It's just an added string to people's bow, and it's actually a way of leveraging therapy quite quickly. So I would always suggest to any sort of therapist really to bring literature as part of your practice, because you'll be amazed at the results and the discussions that you're having because of the literature, the literature on the side. And in terms of your first question, how do we, what traits or characteristics do we look for somebody where the bibliotherapy is going to be effective? I think they really have to be in a place where they're open and honest about how they're feeling. They've really got to be open and honest to themselves, and also open and honest to the literature, so that you've got to, suspend your judgment, your disbelief, your cynicism for a second, and just go with it. Go with allowing this thing to be a therapeutic medium for you. You've also got to be willing to do some analysis. You're also got to be willing to sit with some uncomfortable emotions. But this is why I'm saying when you write things down, that really helps. And you've also got to, I think at the end of the day, and with any therapy, you've got to have a little bit of hope and optimism for the possibility for change, because, that's without that, it's very hard to kind of move forward.
Absolutely. We have another question about what kind of concerns does bibliotherapy help with? You've answered this, but if you could reiterate that it's possible for
Sure.
everything.
So, bibliotherapy can help with so many mental health issues, but just so many day-to-day issues or stress, or, it could be just a form of escapism from something that's a really intense period in your life, just mental fatigue, but also more serious mental health issues like depression, anxiety. There's a lot of great poetry, which is wonderful for depression and anxiety, but also literature that can be really helpful, because it's, essentially seeing yourself represented in the literature. But, to be honest, it's something that's so accessible and so cost effective compared to like a conventional therapy session, that I just wish more people would do it. I honestly think this is going to be the new mindfulness. There's a huge healing power, and we don't use art therapies enough to help us. So to your question, who could it help? It could help for pretty much every mental health issue under the sun. I honestly think there's no damage, unless it's something that's, I don't know, there's a protagonist that's a bit psychopathic. Maybe that's not the best book to read, because you do get literature where you get psychopath protagonists. Then maybe not that literature, but in general, yeah.
We do have a question about the genre. What particular genre of book helps in bibliotherapy? So probably not a book about a killer out there.
Yeah, probably not something where got psychopathic thoughts littering the whole book. But fiction actually is really, really powerful, because it's really allowing you to immerse yourself and escape. But then it depends on what genre you like. So if you're more of a non-fiction reader, maybe a biography or a memoir of somebody who's going through something that you are going through, that's very, very powerful, because you're connecting with the author, you're connecting with their story. There's been a lot of research to say that the same part of your brain lights up when you're reading about somebody else's experience, which has also been your experience. And that is quite healing. So, memoir biography for non-fiction lovers is great. But then if you're a fiction lover, then, there's tons and tons of stories and protagonists that could match up to what your current experience is. Yeah.
Absolutely. You've spoken a bit about audiobooks, but we have another question where a person wants to know that does a person need to be a voracious reader to take this therapy, or is it relevant for someone who is not an avid reader?
It's absolutely relevant to somebody who's not an avid reader. Like I said, you might not enjoy sitting there and reading, in which case you can just sit there and listen to an audiobook. Or you can just be somebody who likes comic books or graphic novels. I mean, they say there's been a lot of research like that actually horror and graphic novels are wonderful for traumatic sort of healing. So there are lots of mediums that would cater to people who are not voracious readers. So there's no real requirement for you to be an avid reader. But, we can definitely find something that works for you. Poetry is also another medium where you don't necessarily need to read a long book. You could just read a poem that takes like a minute to read. So again, depending on your time commitments and what else you've got going on in your life, poetry is actually very accessible.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Could you elaborate on how you select the books? Because we have another question where a person wants to know that how exactly are these books chosen by the client or the therapist, and
Yeah,
how and what are the criteria that you keep in mind? Mm-hmm.
sure. So this is something that we'll definitely cover in the workshop. But the essence is essentially, is the story a right fit for the client? Is this sort of resonating with what they're currently going through? Will they connect with the writing? Will they connect with the author? Again, it's very tailored. So what are your reading genres? Do you prefer fiction, non-fiction? What sort of mediums do you prefer? Do you prefer paperback, Kindle, audio? How much time do you have to read? All of those things are taken into account, especially your own personal history of what you're currently suffering. So we really want to match that up with the literature that we're going to prescribe, because connection with the writing and connection with the protagonist is really, really important. So, the story, essentially the story that we're going to be prescribing, does that connect with your story? That's really the essence of it.
Mm-hmm. Right. We have one more question about the timing. When do you recommend people read? How should they make time for it in their daily lives? What do you
Yeah.
typically suggest?
So what I've noticed is, unless you make reading a regular habit, you're just not going to read. Like, you'll have a long, to be read list, and you'll say, I enjoy reading and I used to read a lot when I was younger. But unless you make it a regular habit, like going to the gym or something that you do daily as part of your routine, you're not going to read. So the most important thing is to create a reading habit. And that could be like reading once a week, reading daily if you have the time, even reading 15 minutes before you go to bed, or if you're too tired, maybe listening to something for 15 minutes, setting that alarm that switches off the book that you're listening to with your AirPods or your headphones or whatever you use, just to kind of establish a date. The key is a routine or regular time set aside to read, and that could be during your lunch break, that could be during your commute, that could be 15 minutes before you're going to bed, even if it's just 15 minutes of reading. You've really got to commit. You, like, just how you would commit to going to the gym, you've got to commit to that, to building that reading practice.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I'm sure our participants are wondering what is this workshop that we've been alluding to. So Bijal, could you tell our participants about what is this workshop that HealthOmind has planned with you?
Sure. So I think it's coming up in November, and the sort of, I think it's the 8th of November. But it's essentially an online comprehensive guide to the practice of bibliotherapy. So we'll cover a lot of the things that I've mentioned in this interview in a lot more detail. So I'll cover like the actual process of bibliotherapy, the selection of books, the curating of reading lists, various different journaling practices. So not just, writing poetry, but a whole host of different, ways of journaling, doing unstructured writing. I'll include a lot more case studies of how books have helped people. And, I will also share some resources of book recommendations for different issues that, you get to keep. So it's a 1-hour workshop. So there's a lot to cover, but I think it's going to be quite helpful for people, especially if they're interested in the subject and interested in mental health, and also interested in developing themselves. Yeah.
Right, absolutely. We have one more question that I think we have the time to take, and this is something that I've been wondering myself. Do you recommend your own book to your clients, and or that you only refer books that you've read yourself?
Sure. So, in terms of the first question, do I recommend my own book? Yeah, I don't think there's any harm from reading my own book, which is called The Happiness Mindset. It's 12 strategies for creating a more sort of happy and fulfilled life. And I think the reviews speak for themselves, so you can check out the reviews on Amazon. But I've had decent feedback on that. So I just hope it helps people sort of live more sort of satisfied lives. And there are 12 strategies in there to allow you to get to a more contented place. And then secondly, do I only recommend books that I've read? I do recommend a lot of literature that I've read, but there's a lot of reading research involved as well. It's almost like a consultancy, because there will inevitably be books that I haven't read, but that I will be prescribing based on industry guidance, based on reviews, research pieces, things that people have studied at university PhDs have written about, just because there'll be, the other day I had a client who wanted some book recommendations on asexuality, and that was fiction. So they obviously wanted to see themselves represented within that. And that's not something that is very common, but that involved a lot of research to see what's going to be effective. And I think this is where my value comes in, because, it's that reading research time. It's also, I have a database of what's worked, what's not worked for clients. And a lot of common issues. I've got some great sort of recommendations. So so I hope that answers your question in terms of whether it's only stuff that I've read, because I think that would be quite limiting. It has to go broader.
Yeah, absolutely great. Bijal, thank you so much. This has been super insightful, and I'm sure our participants are leaving with a better understanding of what book therapy is. So, as Bijal mentioned, she's collaborating with HealthOmind and will be running a workshop on bibliotherapy on Sunday, 8th November at 11 a.m. IST. So, please join us. The workshop introduces the practice of bibliotherapy and how anyone can use the power of literature to heal. It will cover the different bibliotherapy tools and mediums available and how to use bibliotherapy for personal therapy and healing. So we hope you join us on Sunday and hear more from Bijal about her fantastic work in book therapy. Thank you so much, Bijal.
Thank you so much. It's been so lovely. Thank you for having me. I hope to see, have a lot of you attend the workshop.
Super, great.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Apekshita.
Yes. For any details on how you can register, you can check out HealthOmind's social media pages, and you will get a way to register for it.